Hey everybody, welcome back to Golf Test Dummy, the channel where I use my game to help your game, hopefully. Today I thought I'd do something a little bit different. For the last couple of weeks I've been diving into some research on some vintage golf clubs that I've bought in recent months. I wanted to try and figure out some of the history behind these clubs, so I want to share what I've learned with you in this video. And I apologize in advance. It's probably going to get a little bit long-winded, and if you're looking for golf ball smashing action, this is probably not the video for you. I'm sure a lot of you out there are going to thumbs down the video instantly and hate it because it's my face talking for probably about 15 to 20 minutes. Everybody excited? Okay, so let's get started diving into all of the information that I've amassed. I want to say this. When it comes to the internet, I've always said that it's such a great tool, that we really live in a great age where anything that you want to know, building a cob house or how to paddle a canoe or how to navigate by the stars, you can find all of this information in an instant on the internet. It's in the palm of your hand. Everybody is carrying around a phone in their pocket that is more powerful than any computer anybody 50 or 100 years ago could have ever dreamed up. It's in your pocket, and in 2 seconds you can get any piece of information you need. And I've always said that's such a great thing. However, in my attempts to learn more about the vintage clubs that I've been purchasing, who designed them, where they came from, what the story behind it and all of that is, I have learned that there is still a ton of information out there that is either not available online or has been lost, basically in the sands of time. Stories that people have shared at golf clubs or sitting around drinking coffee. If they don't write them down, if they don't commit them to the internet or put them on record, then it just gets lost. And I think that's a real shame, because there are so many stories out there that people have about golf courses and golf clubs and matches that were played and what type of ball did what and all of this stuff. It's just getting lost because the stories are not being documented. They're not being put, into some sort of a record. And when it came to this investigation for the Maxfli Australian Blades, which is what this video is about, I noticed that there was a lack of information on them, but also the information was in bits and pieces all around in different places, different sites, different forums. And some of it you even had to glean from pictures or things like that. And so this is my attempt to take all of the information that I could find about the Australian Blades and sort of condense them down into one package in one place and put them into this video, so that hopefully moving forward, anybody that wants information on it can now come to this video and get all of this stuff in one place. I thought I'd start you out with a little bit of information regarding how many different versions of the Australian Blades there have been, when they came out, and some of the details. So let's begin there. Now I've got about 5 pages of notes that I created for this video, so I apologize if I have to go back and forth and reference these and read. In 1976 is when the name Australian Blades first pops up. From 1976 until 1983, the design, the formation, the makeup of the club heads were basically kind of the same, but they just changed some of the script, the Maxfli script written on the back of it. But the basic die that they used to forge the club heads by remained pretty much the same until 1983. The versions that I have were created between 1981 and 1983. So for those 2 or 3 years, the cursive Maxfli script with no dots and saying Australian Blades along the leading top edge of the club on the back side, like I have, that was from 81 to 83. So that was kind of the end of that first run of the Maxfli Australian Blades. From 85 to 1989, Maxfli released a series of irons called the Pro Specials. The Pro Specials were still forged, and I believe they were Australian Blade inspired, but I found a couple of those Pro Specials like for sale or pictures of them online, but they didn't actually have the words Australian Blade written on them. So I'm really kind of unsure if the Pro Specials were actually supposed to be considered part of the Australian Blade line, or if it was just, hey, we're going to get away from the Australian Blades for a while, we have these new designs of these Pro Specials. After that, Maxfli released the DP30s. So if you look them up, it's Maxfli DP-30. These were again forged clubs, and I've seen like some 1 and 2 irons out there that I could find in that line of irons that actually say Australian Blades on them. So again, it's kind of, they were called DP30s. They were referred to as DP30s, but they, in my research, I have not been able to see where they were referred to as DP30 Australian Blades, even though, like I said, I've seen a couple of pictures with the DP30s that have Australian Blades stamped on them. Now, at this time, the Australian Blades kind of disappear. They go away for a little while until 1992. 1992 saw the introduction of the Maxfli Australian Blade TM-92 blades. This was actually the last forged version of the Australian Blades that would come out, and at the time, Tad Moore was on staff with Maxfli, so he had his hands in designing these TM-92s, and a lot of people regard the TM-92s as the best version of the Australian Blades that ever came out. Tad Moore, of course, is a very famous designer, putters, irons, club heads. He still manufactures clubs today under his own name, but just kind of a legendary designer, and for him to be involved so much in the development of the TM-92s, to me, makes them a very sought-after iron. I would love to get my hands on a set, and I may do that at some point. But this was the last forged version of those. They kind of go away for a while, and they come back with the MCT-97s. This was a cast version. These were designed by Ralph Maltby, who is involved with Golf Works, another legendary designer. He's done tons of stuff. I'm not going to get too deep into him on this, but he designed the MCT-97s. Again, a lot of people, these were very popular. A lot of people love these irons as well. And then they go away again, kind of like the McDonald's McRib. They go away, they come back. They go away, they come back. And the last run, as of this point, was in 2000 to 2001 when they came out with the Maxfli Australian. It just says Australian on the back of it. I'm not even quite sure on the name of these irons, but it's a cast iron. It's got a cavity, and it's got this sort of black, I don't know, I guess it was sort of a hip look at the time, little insert on the back. It just completely got away, if you ask me, from the whole spirit. It's hard to even call them Australian Blades. I think that's why they just put the word Australian on the back of it, is because it had a cavity. They're no longer blades. So it's a completely different version. It's almost like a complete redesign of the club that has nothing to do with the original. Now, if you want to understand Maxfli, we're trying to go back to the beginning, and my original intent for this video was to try and find out who designed the original Australian Blades, where did the idea come from, and if there was something called an Australian Blade prior to 1976, when they became popular in the U.S. and that was their first run, what was the predecessor to the 76 version? What came first, and what led up to that, and what made them special? This becomes a very difficult task, and I don't have anything that is super definitive, but what I can do is provide a lot of background and maybe even some innuendo that leads up to it, to where we can sort of draw our own conclusions, or at least have some idea where these things came from and what inspired this design. In order to do that, we need to understand Maxfli. And in order to understand Maxfli, you need to understand Dunlop. So on the bottom of my clubs, it says Dunlop and then the number of the iron that you're actually looking at. And then on the back, it says Maxfli Australian Blade. So what that tells me is that Dunlop was the manufacturer, Maxfli was some kind of a brand under that umbrella, and sure enough, that's the case. So Dunlop began in 1890. It was a tire company, okay? And we don't need to really get into all of that because it's irrelevant. But needless to say, in the early 1900s, they started getting into sports equipment manufacturing. And in 1910, they were producing solid rubber golf balls. The Maxfli golf ball came out in 1922. So we're talking almost 100 years ago, almost 100 years of the Maxfli golf ball. In 1957, the Dunlop Company bought the John Letters Company. Now, a lot of you have probably heard of John Letters if you are any sort of golf club vintage collector aficionado. You've probably heard the name John Letters. It's synonymous with vintage golf and club design. Again, I'm not going to go off too far on that, but needless to say, John Letters was big time. So in 1957, Dunlop bought the John Letters Company. Around this time, Dunlop also bought Slazenger. Now, Slazenger becomes very important to this story later on, so that's why I wanted to mention the Slazenger Company and Dunlop's purchase of Slazenger. So I'll come back to that. In 1983, the John Letters Company was sold back to the Letters family. So now Dunlop and John Letters are no more. They're done. Then in 1984, Dunlop and Slazenger actually merged. So Dunlop had purchased Slazenger, but they kept them as a separate entity. But then in 1984, they merged. They became the Dunlop Slazenger Company. In 1986, Dunlop Slazenger was acquired by a company called BTR. Now, I've never heard of them, but it was still Dunlop Slazenger. It was just owned by BTR. And then in 1996, they were bought again by a company called Cinven, Cinven. I've never heard of them, not familiar with them. Again, I'm not doing any research on them, but they were purchased by them. So the Slazenger and Maxfli name were sold off separately to reduce debt that Cinven had acquired. So they kind of sold those off and sent them off to other places. Now, like I said, Slazenger is important to the story because of who worked for them and the clubs that were being made prior to the release of the original Maxfli Australian Blades. So I want to get into that a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the Slazenger Company. So the Australian Blades basically came about in the States in 1976 because of these big companies like Slazenger and PGF and Spalding. Those were kind of the big boys during that time. They were just major in the market and around Australia and all over the world, really. Now, you probably haven't heard of PGF. Maybe some of you had, but PGF stands for Precision Golf Forging. Greg Norman was actually associated with them at one point, and they actually were producing golf clubs up until the early 2000s. Now, PGF was a company that, let me see if I can remember this, East Brothers and Chesterfield, these two companies merged, I believe, in the 50s to form PGF. Now, Slazenger, everybody's heard of Slazenger. Slazenger has kind of become one of those sort of in the distant, golf names. Maybe people think, oh, they still make golf balls. And yeah, they still do make golf clubs, like little box sets and things like that now. And of course, they make clothing, but they've kind of gone the way of the dodo as far as trying to compete in the current market of club manufacturers. And their clubs at the time were forged in a small arms factory in Lithgow, Australia, which is located in New South Wales, just west of Sydney. And Sydney is on the east coast of Australia, so that kind of gives you an idea of where Lithgow is. But it was a small arms factory, and that's where the forging process for the Slazenger golf clubs took place. And then they would send them off to another place to be finished and all of that. At the time, Australia was actually a pretty major hub of golf club manufacturing overseas. The high import taxes made clubs from outside of Australia very expensive to people, and they couldn't afford them. So it did Australia a lot of good from my research. Maybe some of my Australian friends can help me out here, but it did them a lot of good to basically make clubs in their own country so that people could afford them. It's just a seriously high import tax. Now, why is Slazenger important? Slazenger is very, very important to this story because of a guy named Alex Sandy Faichney. He went by the name Sandy. He was a club designer. He is pivotal to this story. He came to Australia in 1948 to work for the Slazenger Company in Australia. He was a Scotsman, and he moved his family over here, and he worked for Slazenger in their Alexandria factory, which is near Sydney, again. And he lived in Carlingford, Australia, and that's near North Rocks, which, again, this is near Sydney. And North Rocks is significant because the Barclay Golf and Country Club was in North Rocks. It was just down the street. You can see where Carlingford is, and you can see where North Rocks is if you look at Google Maps, and it looks like it's maybe a mile apart. I could be wrong, but again, maybe some of my Australian friends can help me out here. Sandy Faichney is living in Australia near Sydney. He moved here in 1948. Several years later, there was a dentist, a dentist named Dr. Weirn, W-E-A-R-N, Dr. Weirn, who ran the Barclay Golf and Country Club. He owned it. It was his baby. Sandy would go play down there all the time because it was right down the street. So that was, naturally where he would end up playing. And they renamed it Muirfield. You can see that on the map today, that Muirfield is still there. They've got a website. They've got a Facebook. The Muirfield Golf Club is right there in North Rocks. This has big ties to Sandy Faichney. Sandy was known to fit and build for many of the top Australian pros, as well as a lot of top American pros when they would come overseas to play in tournaments and visit. A lot of top pros. You're talking Arnold Palmer. You're talking Jack Nicklaus. Talking Lee Trevino, some of the Aussie guys like David Graham. Sandy built clubs for all of these people. Now, Lee Trevino says that he won all of his majors after 1969 with Sandy's irons. This is kind of important because Lee Trevino was under contract to another company at the time. Several companies, actually, he would, kind of trade off throughout his career. But he took these irons and would put tape on the back of these irons because he was not supposed to be playing them. So, a little bit of, I don't know. But, from what I understand, there were a lot of pros that did that at the time. They would put their name on something else. They'd be endorsed by somebody else. And they would, just play other irons, the ones that gave them the best performance. Another big name in golf, Jack Nicklaus. He made a bunch of effort, apparently, to try and get Sandy to come to the States to work for him and his company, and Sandy refused. He I guess, basically said thanks for the offer, but I'm going to stay here in Australia. He was an Aussie through and through from that time, I guess, and that's the legend anyway. There's no documentation to back that up. This is all just stories that came from word of mouth. But Jack Nicklaus tried to get him to come to the States to work for him, and he didn't, obviously. Now, if I go back to Lee Trevino, there's a story that Trevino gave in an interview with Guy Yoakum that is really one of the biggest pieces of information in this puzzle that I can find. So Lee Trevino said that the best set of irons that he ever had and that he ever played were made by Sandy Faichney after his visit there in 1969. The story kind of goes like this. David Graham, who is a very famous Australian golfer, everybody, probably in Australia knows who David Graham and Greg Norman are. And David Graham was huge at the time. And David Graham was actually a really fine club maker in his own right for a long time in the latter part of his career and into the days after his career. So anyway, David Graham tells Trevino, you got to go see Sandy. Trevino goes and tracks this guy down. And apparently Sandy is sort of in his workshop, sitting on a bench or a stool, I guess, at his workbench. And Trevino comes in, and there's these barrels just full of club heads and shafts. Some are put together, some are not, and the barrels are just chock full of all these old club parts and club components and pieces and full sets of clubs. And Trevino comes in and introduces himself, and Sandy, according to Trevino, is just going on and on about how nobody appreciates my clubs anymore. they're mass produced now, all of this and that and the other. And he's basically just lamenting that nobody cares about his clubs anymore and nobody's interested. And now he's surrounded by his life's work and it's all worthless. So Trevino begins to dig through some of the barrels and he's looking at some of the club heads and some of the clubs that are made. And he would find a few here and there that really kind of intrigued him. And so he says that he asked Sandy, hey, if I find, the club heads and the shafts in here that I like, can you put them together for me and build me a set out of them? And Sandy says, absolutely. So Trevino starts taking the club heads that he likes and he'll dry fit shafts down into these iron heads and set them on the ground and have a look at them and see if it suited his eye and see if he thought it was good. And then he'd have Sandy build it and put it together. And I don't know if this was a matched set. I don't know what the design was, what the name of the irons were. This is, again, where it kind of gets into this gray area where you've just lost all this information. And Trevino's probably got some of this information, but maybe he can't remember some of it. And Sandy has passed on. So, again, you can't go back. This is all stuff that I want to know, that maybe a lot of you want to know, that I just can't find information on. So if any of you out there have bits and pieces of this puzzle, please comment down below and add these to the story so that anybody looking for the same information can come to this one place and find it. So anyway, Sandy builds Lee this set of irons, and Lee loves them. And so he takes them out, and he has to put tape across the name on the back. And I'm guessing that the name on the back had to have the Slazenger label because Sandy worked for Slazenger at the time, right? Now, maybe they were a Slazenger, Sandy Faichney or something, or the Slazenger SF-19s. I don't know. But anyway, Lee has this set of clubs. He has to put tape over the back because he's with another company, remember. And he proceeds to go off and win the 71 and 72 Open. He says he won all of his majors after 1969 with those irons. Time passes, and Trevino kind of hits a slump. He's having a down period with ball striking. And so he must have thought that the clubs were a little bit too heavy for him at the time. Like maybe he was getting older and he couldn't swing the weighted club as well or whatever. But he puts them under a drill press and starts to drill holes in these irons to remove some of the material, to remove some of the weight so they'll be lighter. And Trevino says to this day that he still has those clubs and he cries almost every time he looks at them because he ruined them. He ruined those irons by drilling those holes in the back of them. He said they were never the same. They never played as well. It definitely didn't solve his ball striking issues, and he had to move on to another set of clubs after that, which I think is just a tragic story. To kind of understand and wrap everything up, basically I don't have an idea which irons directly preceded the Maxfli Australian Blades that we came to know in 1976. But I can tell you that they were definitely a product that was created because of all of the American touring pros that would go overseas to different places. And when they would come to Australia or they would go to Europe and they would play, they were enamored by a lot of the clubs that they could get over there that you couldn't get here. And when Sandy was in his workshop for the Slazenger company, all the top pros would line up to get him to build a set of clubs. Nicholas Player, Trevino, Palmer, they all paid Sandy a visit. And I would have to say that when they produced the Australian Blades, the first run in 1976, it had to be inspired by Alex Sandy Faichney's designs for the Slazenger company. And Slazenger had to be, the main inspiration for that. I really wish I could find the irons that Trevino talked about. I can't find anything like that online. Trevino would certainly know. I can't just call up Lee Trevino and say, hey Lee, send me some pictures of those irons and what were they called? That would be great information to know. That would be, really the missing link in this puzzle, in this timeline. That's basically what all I found out, though. And, you could go off on all sorts of different branches from this information. You could find out more about PGF and the Greg Norman and all of this stuff and East Brothers and Chesterfield. You could definitely go down a rabbit hole and find out more about the Slazenger company. I can't find much more information on Sandy Faichney. I just found the one picture of him. And even on the Muirfield Golf Club's Facebook and website, there's no mention of him in the history. There's no mention of him in the history. It mentions Dr. Weirn. It mentions him, the dentist that originally built the club. And they say that he built it for his wife, Polly, which my wife's name is Polly. I thought that was kind of fun. But he built this golf course for his wife, Polly, who was apparently a really good golfer. Sandy was actually the captain of this club for like 5 years. So he's woven into the history of Muirfield there near Sydney, Australia, in North Rocks. And there's just no mention of him on the club website or on the Facebook page, nothing. It's kind of weird. There's got to be a story there. But again, I didn't really dig into that. Maybe, again, like I said, some Australian friends, maybe people who actually have played Muirfield, maybe people who live near Sydney, maybe anybody's got any information. I would love to hear from you. If you could put something down in the comment section below, if you've got a piece to this story, if you've got any information, please add it to this. And I hope a lot of this is accurate. I'm sure there's some people out there that say, no, this right here, that's kind of not right. I think you've got this wrong. But again, this was just my research. I did a book report on it. It was the best I could do. I'm really interested. Now, I want to also dive into Cobra, because Cobra is another Australian company, and Greg Norman seems to be the sort of common denominator between this and that. And I just thought it was really cool that also Lee Trevino, who is my favorite golfer, somehow led me into a rabbit hole with the Australian Blades, which is the set of clubs that I wanted, that I got. It also ties in with the Cobra irons because of Australia. It's just everything is interwoven and very incestuous. So I can't get into everything in this video, but I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it enlightens you a little bit. And let me know down in the comments below if you got any more information that I'm missing. I intend to do a video on the Cobras and the Cobra Company and Greg Norman and all that very soon. But for now, I appreciate the support you guys give the channel. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.